It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC CQ32G4VE. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. You'll find links to additional content in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 31.5-inch VA panel with a 2560x1440, 1440p or QHD resolution, support for up to 180Hz refresh rate, and there's also a 1500R or moderate curve to the screen. So to quickly touch upon that curve, when you're looking at images of the monitor and videos of the monitor, it looks like there's a pincushion effect. It pinches in the middle. You don't actually notice it like that when you're using the monitor in person. You may have a sensation of the curve, and it's stronger when you first start using the monitor, but after you've been using it for a few days and certainly a few weeks, you really get very used to the curve and you pretty much forget it's there. It isn't a super strong curve or anything like that for a screen of this size. I found the experience very different to a 1000R curved screen of this size, for example, where I find the curve difficult to ignore and quite annoying, particularly if I'm on the desktop. In this case, I really found the curve felt quite natural and not something I was really focusing on much. It did draw me in a little bit, gave me a bit of an extra feeling of depth when I'm using the monitor, which I quite liked when I was playing games and watching movies, but it didn't annoy me on the desktop. So it is something which I think you can adapt to and get used to, although I do understand some people still prefer flat screens. As for the QHD resolution on a screen of this size, you get a good amount of desktop real estate, decent clarity to text, so it's a similar pixel density to a 24-inch Full HD model. So it's not very high, but also not very low at the same time. It's just a moderate pixel density. It gives you reasonable clarity to suitably high-resolution image content as well, and that will include games. And of course the size of the screen, depending on your viewing distance, it's pretty immersive. I tend to sit with my eyes around 70 centimeters from this screen, and I certainly did find it immersive when I was playing games and watching video content. I'm now going to talk a bit about the refresh rate supported by the monitor and some associated features. So connected via DisplayPort, I'm using DisplayPort 1.4 here. I've got up to 180Hz at the native QHD resolution. You have an 8-bit signal at the same time. There's HDR support and VRR. You can use adaptive sync. It supports FreeSync, and you can also use Nvidia's G-Sync compatible, which is what I'm using throughout this review. If you want to be using a 10-bit color signal, then you have to set the monitor to 120Hz or below. For most content this doesn't matter, because under SDR most content is 8-bit, and for HDR the monitor can use 10-bit processing by other means, even at higher refresh rates than 120Hz. Using HDMI you're limited to 144Hz maximum, the QHD resolution, got an 8-bit signal again, HDR support, and you have support for AMD FreeSync, but you can't use Nvidia G-Sync compatible. There's no HDMI VRR support, so you can't use VRR on the PS5. Remember, with some of the Xbox consoles, such as the Xbox Series X, you can use FreeSync via HDMI. If you want to use a high bit depth signal via HDMI, you have to be running the monitor at 60Hz, and that will allow you to use 10 bits and also 12 bits per channel. Again, don't automatically think this is going to be better to use because of that. Considering 12 bits per channel in particular, very little content will use that. I'm going to briefly touch upon the scaling capabilities of the screen, so I'm using the full native QHD resolution at the moment. I'm now running the monitor at 120Hz Full HD 1920 by 1080 or 1080p. The monitor supports a scaling or interpolation process at 120Hz and below. If you wanted to run the monitor at 180Hz Full HD, for example, you'd have to be using GPU scaling, which you can of course use. I personally find the monitor's interpolation process a little bit softer than I'd like. It doesn't present things in a super soft way, but actually GPU scaling seems to sharpen things up a little bit more, so bear that in mind depending on your preference you have for sharpness. As I usually find with AOC monitors though, there is no sharpness control in the OSD, so you can't really change this in a neat way. You could use one of the HDR modes, not to be confused with actually using HDR on the monitor, so the monitor's running SDR and these are just weird little additional presets really. HDR picture gives you a bit of a sharpness filter, and I find it over-sharpened now. It's certainly sharper, but it's over-sharpened. It also oversaturates things. Some people might prefer how this looks overall, so that is an option. HDR movie, which gives extreme over sharpening, like there's some kind of weird foil over the picture, and very strong over saturation. HDR game, well, just ramps things up even further. Personally, I would have preferred to have had a sharpness control which is independent of these little HDR settings, and also more control over the level of sharpness you actually get on the screen for using these non-native resolutions. Again, I wouldn't say it's terrible and it's not unusable, and a screen of this size running the full HD resolution is never going to look amazing. It really just depends on how far you're sitting from the screen. So I'd say that the interpolation process overall is okay in this case, but not as flexible as I'd like to see. There's also an image ratio setting in picture if you're not using adaptive sync, so you can't use adaptive sync or VRR at the same time as adjusting this. So full's the default, and that's what it's going to be using if you're using adaptive sync, where it fills the whole screen. There's an aspect setting which is only available with certain aspect ratio resolutions that you're selected and you're scaling for. So this is a 16:9 monitor and a 16:9 resolution I'm running, so there's no aspect setting available. There's 1:1, which is a pixel mapping setting. There are some additional settings there which simulate different screen sizes and aspect ratios. Be aware that you can't access the image ratio setting using the native resolution, or I wasn't able to. So not only do you have to have adaptive sync disabled, you have to be actually running a non-native resolution, and the monitor has to be using its own scaling, as I'm doing here. So the 17-inch 4:3, 19-inch 4:3, 19-inch 5:4, 19-inch 16:10, 21.5-inch 16:9, 22-inch 16:10, 23-inch 16:9, 23.6-inch 16:9, 24-inch 16:9, and finally 27-inch 16:9. And back to full screen. And just quickly back to the 1:1 pixel mapping setting, I've also realised that if I changed from full to one of the other settings here with the scaling, it actually disabled low input lag as well, which gives a horrendous input delay. It really does feel horribly laggy, and I tried this at the native resolution as well, having low input lag disabled, and it really did feel horrible. So really the scaling options here are very restrictive on this monitor. There's no sharpness control. You have to be using the non-native resolution without adaptive sync to access the additional scaling options, and you have to have low input lag off. But really, when you're gaming on the monitor, you're going to be wanting to use that low input lag setting, or you'll be wanting to use adaptive sync, which basically forces that setting on and it greys it out. So you're really better off doing what you can with GPU scaling rather than relying on the scaling of the monitor. I'm now going to look at the external features of the monitor. So from the front, lots of matte black plastic. I wouldn't say it's the most premium design or the most solidly built monitor, but it doesn't feel super cheap either, or super flimsy. The screen has the popular dual stage bezel design, which means there is a panel border flush with the rest of the screen, and that blends in well when the screen is switched off as it is now. You can see it a bit more clearly when the screen is switched on as it is elsewhere in the review. And then there's a thin hard plastic outer part. The screen has what I'd classify as a light matte anti-glare finish to it, so that means it offers good glare handling. Because of the curve of the screen, you can get glare that's stretched across the screen. You'll be able to see that here, and as I move, stretches across the screen in various different ways. But either way, good glare handling, especially from a normal viewing position. The screen offers tilt as the only ergonomic flexibility. So for example, there's a fixed height to the screen. It does sit a reasonable distance from the desk, so the bottom of the screen is around 100mm or 3.94 inches above the desk. The top of the screen is 523mm or 20.6 inches or so above the desk. For those interested, the depth of the stand, that's around 265mm or 10.43 inches. And also of note at the front, the OSD controls, they face downwards towards the right side of the screen, and there are some printed on button labels as well. Not easy to see in a dark room. You can see the menu itself in action in the best settings video. At the rear, plenty more matte black plastic and a little bit of a glossy element there. The included stand, that attaches using 3 screws which are included in the box. There's 2 different types of screws, by the way. There's one for the bottom bits and a different screw type for the top. If you wish to use 100 by 100mm VESA mounting, then you can remove this central plate there. See, there's a little place for a screwdriver or a thin blunt knife or whatever prying tool you might choose to use. And you can just pop that off, and that will reveal your provision for the VESA mounting. The ports face downwards. There is a DisplayPort 1.4 port, 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and an AC power input, so the monitor has an internal power converter. There's also a K slot. The monitor does not have integrated speakers. I'm now just going to quickly talk about interlace pattern artifacts. I wasn't able to capture these properly by camera, so I'll just talk about them. They aren't something most people will find bothersome, but sensitive users might. So static interlace patterns were observed, and that's where shades appeared as alternating horizontal lines of a slightly darker and lighter version of the intended shade. And these were observed for various shades, including some blues, orange and very light shades. That's not to say all blues, all oranges, or all of the time observed this with very light shades. It was only certain shades and sometimes only certain parts of the screen where this was observed. They weren't easy to see at lower refresh rates in the double digits, but I found them more obvious as refresh rate increased. They were slightly noticeable in places by 120Hz and more so up to the maximum 180Hz of the monitor. But even at 180Hz, I wouldn't say they were super obvious, and things appeared generally better blended than I've seen on some other VA models where I've observed this kind of issue. Dynamic interlace patterns were also observed, and that's when I was scanning my eyes across the screen horizontally, and generally lighter greys and blues showed this most clearly. I could sometimes see that the image appeared to break up into a fine mesh of small polygons. These can appear to come and go depending on how your eyes are moving, like a sort of interference pattern. These appear in a pretty much inverse way to the static interlace patterns, so by 60Hz there was an obvious pattern when I was observing movement with certain content displayed, or often simply scanning my eyes across the screen. They were significantly fainter by 120Hz and certainly beyond that. So in the triple digits, most people are unlikely to notice them, and some people won't really notice them at all, even in the double digits. In both cases, these interlace patterns apply in a similar way, whether talking about a static refresh rate or a refresh rate achieved under VRR. And while I call these interlace pattern artifacts, some people might call these scan lines or inversion artifacts. Taking a quick look now at the subpixels of the screen. So this has a normal RGB stripe subpixel layout without partial subpixel illumination, split subpixels, or other odd subpixel quirks. So this is the standard expected by Windows, so you don't need to run through ClearType to make changes, but you might wish to do so and adjust according to your own preferences anyway. There is a slight issue with the subpixels in that they're a bit squat with relatively large gaps above and below each subpixel. Because of the reasonable pixel density here, the gaps are still small, so they don't cause major issues. Text appeared just a touch softer than I'd expect from a monitor with this pixel density. Adjusting ClearType didn't really change that, and there's no sharpness control in the OSD if you wanted to try and offset this a bit. Most people will find the text representation fine and will actually enjoy using the monitor for productivity with its slightly inkier look due to the relatively strong contrast compared to competing IPS offerings. Shifting attention now to the calibration of the monitor, the table here shows central average gamma reading taken using a calibrite colorimeter and a white point recorded using a data color colorimeter with various different monitor settings tested. So out of the box I got a 2.16 gamma and a 7046K white point, so things are a bit cool and the gamma on average is a bit lower than I'd like to see, but not too bad. The sRGB setting, that is an sRGB emulation mode, so you set the color space to sRGB. You have to be using the standard mode of the monitor, as I explained in the best settings video, to access that. And that was pretty similar in terms of the key readings given here, although I will explore gamma in more detail shortly, and will show you that there are some differences to be aware of. I also like to talk a little bit about low blue light settings on the monitor. I know some people like to use these. The reading mode, that gives a warm greenish yellow tint to the image, but it is an effective low blue light setting. It gave a 4930K white point, which is definitely on the warm side. It reduces the blue light output from the monitor significantly, especially when paired with lower brightness. Under my test settings, I recorded a gamma of 2.10 and a white point of 6552K. I wasn't able to get closer to 6500K because to do that I'd have to decrease the blue channel an additional notch, but then it got really quite close to 6400K. So you don't get super fine control of the white point or the color balance on this monitor, so be careful with your adjustments. The second table there, that shows how I set my monitor up with my test settings. And these are also explored in the best settings video if you're interested in that. And as I note at the bottom there, individual units and preferences vary, so these won't be optimal in all cases. ICC profiles aren't used in the review, but I do include one created using the test settings in the description of the video if you wish to try it out. Looking at gamma in a bit more detail now, this is under my test settings. It's pretty similar out of the box. You can see that, yes, the gamma is a bit lower than 2.2 on average. Really it tracks closer to 2.1 than 2.2. Generally the deviation isn't massive, with most shades being just a touch brighter than intended. The most noteworthy deviation occurs for 98% grey, so the lightest shade measured here, where it's close to 1.9. With some very bright shades being brighter than intended, it does mean that they blend into white a bit more readily than they should. For 2% grey, so that's the darkest shade measured here, a gamma of 2.0 was recorded. This slightly offsets the minor black crush this model has, and I'll come back to that. Using colour space equals sRGB, so the sRGB emulation setting of the screen, that lifts gamma up a bit in most places, so it runs a bit closer to 2.2, or somewhere between 2.1 and 2.2. The gamma also gets progressively lower as shades become darker. So the gamma tracking approximates sRGB rather than a linear 2.2 gamma. This gives an uplifted look to many dark shades, but because of black crush, the darkest shades still appear well blended, at least when they're displayed towards the central mass of the screen. I've mentioned black crush a few times now, so I guess it's worth exploring it in a little bit more detail. It's demonstrated with what I call the PCM black crush test. All this is it's a black background with a very dark grey text which says PCM throughout the image, and you'll be able to see that things are more blended in the central region, so that's the bit which is in line with the camera or would be in line with your eyes if you're looking at the screen, than it is elsewhere on the screen. This kind of shift and the masking of detail, it isn't as extreme as on some VA models, because this model is actually relatively strong in terms of performance here, but there's still definitely some masking of detail for the area of the screen observed directly. So if you're thinking about gamma, this means that the perceived gamma is actually increased for the region of the screen directly in line with your eyes, so roughly the central region of the screen, or a bit above centre from an ergonomically correct viewing position. Whereas if you're looking at peripheral regions of the screen, and that's not just the top and bottom, it would be the extreme edges as well, then there can actually be a bit of excessive detail. So things are uplifted too much, and that's because the perceived gamma is lower than intended. And that was with my test settings. I've just switched over to the sRGB setting, which, as I mentioned, does give significant uplift. And you can see that there's still that black crush. You can see it's really quite a small area that's affected there. It is more blended, again, in line with the camera, or where your eyes would be. But with the sRGB setting, there's still decent visibility for this particular shade. There are, of course, shades between black and that dark grey, and they do tend to be even more blended than you can see there. But either way, with the sRGB setting, there's a significant uplift to some of these dark grey shades, like the PCM text there, compared to using my test settings, or basically compared to using the default gamma tracking of the screen. And just to reinforce this a bit, this is the Lagom Black Levels test, lagom.nl, the Black Levels test there. You won't be able to see exactly what you see by eye on the video, but it'll give you an idea of the relative change the sRGB setting makes. So this is my test settings, and by eye, the first row, really, the top row, more blended than it should be. It's usual with 2.2 gamma tracking for the first few blocks, perhaps the first three, to be pretty well blended, but the fourth and fifth definitely more blended than they should be. With the sRGB setting, it lifts things up a lot, but actually the first few blocks there, they're more blended than you'd expect, given the gamma recorded for such shades, but that's because there is a bit of that black crush going on. I also like to talk a little bit about sRGB colour accuracy, so this is using the sRGB setting, and this is the Spider Checker 48 test patch collection. As usual, shade 1F cerulean, that is the highest error. Colorimeters seem to be very sensitive to the balance of blue and green with this particular shade. It's just a bit of an awkward shade. Don't worry too much about that, it's always the highest error, almost always the highest error. But you'll see that some of the blue shades are also off base. 6F Royal Blue, for example, you've got a delta E of 3.3, compared to the average delta E, which is actually pretty respectable at 1.22. The large part of this is because the sRGB setting has the colour temperature, on my unit at least, was a little bit above 7000K rather than being close to 6500K, so that does impart a cool tint. If you want better flexibility, remember, you could use an alternative sRGB setting, and I talk a little bit about that in the best settings video, but there's also an article on the website all about sRGB emulation and alternative methods of doing that at the GPU level whilst keeping your monitor settings completely unlocked, like I would be for my test settings. So you can adjust the colour channels on the monitor, for example. And since I mentioned that article, I will link to it in the description of the video, just so it's easy for you to find. Shifting attention now to the contrast and brightness performance of the monitor, some figures first off. So this table here shows the recorded white luminance, black luminance, and a calculated contrast ratio. These readings were taken using the Calibrite colorimeter. The maximum luminance I recorded was 398 nits, which is reasonably bright, and the minimum was 39 nits, which is reasonably dim. So there's a good brightness adjustment range there. will suit most people. Most people will set their monitor somewhere between 100 and 200 nits. So having between 39 and 398 nits, at least that's what I recorded on this table, is quite generous. The contrast ratio sat close to 4,000 to 1. That's nice to see. That's a good, strong VA performance. Under my test settings, I actually recorded 4,075 to 1, which happened to be the highest contrast ratio recorded on this table. But the reason for that is really just fortunate rounding. So what does this all mean in practice? Well, I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So with a 4,000 to 1 static contrast ratio, if you're sitting in a dark room like I am now, you don't get an OLED-like depth and inkiness to things, or even the depth you might get to some of the medium shades, but the monitor's relatively strong in that respect, certainly when you compare to LCDs with IPS panels or TN panels, and without some kind of fancy local dimming going on, which you won't be getting at this price. So you might notice there's a bit of a kind of murkiness, and that's not something you would see on an OLED, but that murkiness isn't just related to the contrast ratio, although that is part of it, but it's a bit stronger towards the corners of the screen and actually the top and bottom edge in general. And that's a bit of what I would call VA glow, not to be confused with IPS glow because it's not as strong and it doesn't eat away at detail in quite the same way. And it's something which is brought out more strongly for using a higher brightness setting on the monitor, if you're sitting closer to the monitor, and if your unit has an issue with backlight bleed or clouding, or a significant issue there. Mine does have a bit of clouding at the top and bottom, and it's a little bit more concentrated towards the bottom left there, so that's why you'll see a bit of a stronger bloom there. But I have noticed with curved VA models just in general, there is very commonly some clouding at the top and bottom edges of the screen. It does vary between individual units, but this is just a general observation I've had, and just thinking about all of the curved VA models I've had, I wouldn't say this one is particularly bad at all in that respect. And yes, you do get that black crush as well when you're observing more central regions of the screen, which in this particular scene is really where the torch is shining, which isn't very useful, but I did demonstrate black crush earlier in the calibration section, so I don't really have much to add to that. Just to say that yes, it does mask some of the dark details in games, but as I mentioned, not extreme in this case, and if you wanted to offset it, you could use the sRGB setting. There are also various different gamma settings of the monitor, but be aware that with this, when you're observing these darker shades peripherally, then you can get some over brightening. So I've just switched over quickly to the sRGB setting. That gives much better detail levels, but really it gives too much of an uplift, so there are excessive detail levels. Either way, some people like this look, and that's fine. It's an option if you do. And back to my test settings, which, like the factory defaults of the monitor, more masked appearance. I've brightened the room up a bit, so you'll see that if you're not sitting in a dark or dimly lit room, then it kind of draws your eye away from the imperfections and contrast I was talking about. But of course, that will also invite some glare onto the screen that is visible for the darker regions naturally, and this isn't a particularly bright room. Of course, it would be worse if I brightened it up more. In fact, I'll just do that just to demonstrate this. So now I've got a bit of light striking the screen surface directly. The glare handling of this one, as I mentioned earlier in the review, it's quite good, but with any matte screen surface where you've got glare hitting the screen, it also floods the image. So even when you're looking at brighter shades or the medium shades here, it just dulls things because the light is being scattered, it's being diffused across the screen. That's how anti-glare screen surfaces work. Something else I like to talk about, considering the brighter shades, this does apply more broadly, but just for the brighter shades it would be most apparent, and that is the screen surface's textures. It's what I would classify as a light matte anti-glare finish, so it has a bit of layering. That's to say that you're kind of aware of the surface texture, or I am because I'm sensitive to it. When you're using the screen, it doesn't have the kind of direct appearance that a glossy screen surface has, but it's also not as thick and smeary and layered in its appearance as some matte screen surfaces. It doesn't have strong graininess to it either. It has what I would describe as a very light misty graininess. It actually appears fairly smooth as far as matte screen surfaces go. So if a grainy appearance to an image is something you don't like with matte screen surfaces, you might actually find this one okay, because it's really not too bad at all in that respect. I'm on lagom.nl, the website again, and I'm going to talk about colour consistency. And this is to say how a given shade will appear at the centre of the screen versus elsewhere. And I've already touched upon this in terms of the gamma tracking and black crush. It also affects your colourful elements. So the Lagom text test that appears more blended in the central region of the screen where the black crush will be present, and surrounding that there is a more colourful appearance to the striping of the text, so you can see some oranges and some reds. And this all indicates a moderate viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. The purple block always appears bizarre on the video. By eye, there isn't this kind of pink ball in the middle there. It's actually kind of the inverse of what it appears on the video. So it is pinker towards the edges, the bottom of the screen. It depends on your viewing position as well. It might not be the bottom of the screen. If you're viewing it from a little bit lower down, then you'll see it more pink towards the top. But these shifts again are just related to some slight weaknesses in viewing angles, but nothing too extreme, certainly not for a VA panel. The red block, that appears reasonably consistent, a rich red throughout the screen, but it does appear a bit more of a faded red peripherally. The green block, that appears a fairly consistent yellowish-green chartreuse throughout the screen, but it appears a bit darker, like a bit of a vignetting effect, if you like, towards the edges of the screen and particularly the corners of the screen. The blue block appears a fairly consistent royal blue throughout the screen, very slightly darker towards the extreme edges, but less noticeable than with that chartreuse shade. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So on monitors like this, with a wider colour gamut than sRGB, if you're using that full gamut, so if you're playing a game like this, you're on the desktop, you're not using colour management, or you're just watching a movie, something like that, then with this full native gamut that extends beyond sRGB, you get some extra vibrancy and extra saturation, so some oversaturation. The native gamut of this monitor, when compared to the sRGB colour space, looks like this. So I recorded a gamut volume of 124.5% sRGB. You can see that with the rainbow coloured line versus the dotted grey line, which shows the reference sRGB space. And if you compare to DCI-P3, you get a fair bit of coverage of DCI-P3, although not complete. So with the scene here, I can see some quite vibrant looking sky blues here, overly vibrant, not as pastel looking as they should, although in this particular scene on the game, they're actually supposed to look a little bit lively, but not quite as sort of cartoonish as they look here. I have to say though, the saturation isn't as strong or as extreme as I've seen on some models with a wider gamut, and also there are some saturation losses similar to what I was talking about earlier with Lagom, when you're comparing the central bulk of the screen where you get the strongest saturation, and it is a little bit lower towards the peripheral regions of the screen. And that would be more exaggerated if you're sitting particularly close to the monitor, but from my regular viewing position, eyes around 70 centimeters from the screen, it's not too pronounced for a VA model. Definitely still some of that going on, especially lower down the screen from my normal viewing position, but it's not extreme. Other shades as well, the greens of the grass look a bit lively as well. And I've noticed skin tones, you can't see any here. They tend to look a bit oversaturated in the central bulk of the screen, but actually can look a little bit undersaturated for some skin tones towards the extreme peripheral regions of the screen. But overall, you can expect a pretty vibrant experience if you're using the full native gamut of the monitor with some oversaturation. If you want to tone things down, have a more as the developers intend within the confines of the sRGB colour space type of look, you could use the sRGB setting of the monitor, or alternative sRGB emulation. So I'm just going to switch over to that sRGB setting of the monitor. And that does indeed tone things down. So the sky blue, more muted. The greens are more muted. The other shades as well. Not sure if those bullets coming towards me were any more muted than before, but probably. So the colour gamut now, it looks like this. You've got 98% sRGB coverage with very little extension beyond. So it is an effective sRGB gamut clamp. But as I mentioned before, you do have restricted controls now. You can't change the gamma, for example, and you can't change the colour channels, although you can, thankfully, adjust the brightness of the monitor. Back to my test settings now. So if you're using this monitor for colour critical work, you have to be aware of those colour consistency issues I raised before. At the hobbyist level, I wouldn't say this is something you have to worry too much about, but if you do want the strongest colour accuracy, it's worth being aware of. It's also worth being aware of the gamut itself again. 88.2% DCI-P3, you don't get full DCI-P3 coverage, which isn't ideal if you want to work within that colour space. And as for Adobe RGB, I measured 82.1% Adobe RGB coverage, so quite a lot of coverage of that colour space missing. But you can certainly work within the sRGB colour space, or you could work within the DCI-P3 colour space as well. Just be aware of the limitations. And to quickly talk about off-angle performance. So as usual for VA model, there is some washout as you go off-angle, so things sort of brighten up as you go off horizontally. Quite a flooded look to the image in that case. If you're sitting a little bit below the monitor, perhaps you're on a couch or a bed below the monitor looking up at it, it's okay because it sort of gives you a little bit of a deeper look, as if the gamma's been raised a bit, but It's not too bad, I'd say it's kind of usable there. And further up, you get the inverse, so things start washing out a bit like I was showing you horizontally. So as far as VA models go, the viewing angles are actually alright. I'm now going to briefly talk about the HDR performance. I do mean briefly because I want to respect your time and my time, because the HDR on this monitor is really not good at all. That's not just because of the limited hardware capabilities. There's no local dimming. The monitor doesn't use any dynamic contrast either. When you use HDR, it basically just stays at a moderately high brightness for the backlight and doesn't change from there. But it's also because the monitor just isn't well calibrated under HDR. Certainly my unit wasn't. So what you get here, you get 353 nits if you're using the display HDR setting of brightness, or 389 nits if you're using one of the other HDR settings. And you'll see these are explored in a bit more detail in the best settings video. I don't intend to spend much time going through them here. As I noted in the best settings video, my preference is HDR picture, but it's not a strong preference exactly. It's probably between HDR picture and display HDR. HDR picture adds a bit of extra saturation, but to be completely honest, it really has some oversaturated elements whilst there's a sort of overriding fogginess to the image. It really just looks as if it's SDR with the gamma set too low overall and the gamut not used properly. So Lara's face here looks completely washed out, the skin tone for example. The greens here don't look as lush as they should. Certainly the monitor isn't using the gamut it has to its full potential. I mean, it's not a massive gamut, but it's still got, roughly 90% DCI-P3 coverage, so it could certainly be doing more than this, although some green shades are oversaturated when you're using the HDR picture setting. Even more so when you're using the other HDR settings, except for display HDR. Anyway, do check out the best settings video if you're interested in a bit more about this. It's also too cool, the color temperature, around 7500K, and you can't correct that in the OSD. You do get 10-bit color processing used under HDR, but given the shortcomings I've mentioned, I can't really say that it gives you smoother gradients either, because everything's just really wacky and just doesn't look as it should at all under HDR. It does give a different look to things again, but I mean, things looking different isn't really necessarily a good thing. It certainly looks better under SDR in my view. And there are also some really overdone coppery tones just to mention in this scene. So the rocks here have these really rich, weird looking coppery tones which look out of place and cartoonish. I did mention some things you might want to do in the best settings video, for example, reducing the gamma in Nvidia control panel and running through the Windows HDR calibration wizard and upping the saturation there, maximizing saturation while sticking to the display HDR setting. But if you're doing that, you'd have to then undo those things when you go to SDR. And also, even if you happen to get things just to your liking under HDR, you're just going to be limited on the hardware side anyway. And ultimately, the experience is just more flexible and really more enjoyable under SDR on this monitor, in my opinion. I should also add that if you set the monitor to 120Hz or below to ensure it can use a 10-bit signal on the monitor rather than using GPU or software dithering to fill in the gaps, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever, or certainly not to the aspects I've been talking about here. Taking a look now at the responsiveness of the monitor, starting out with some pursuit photographs. If you aren't familiar with these, and you aren't familiar with any of the other terms that I'm using in this section, please be sure to check out the responsiveness article, which is linked to in the video description. So you can see behind the UFO there's some somewhat smeary looking trailing. Using the normal setting, it's not terrible for a VA panel. It doesn't extend miles back or anything like that. It's not super bold like you get on some VA models. And it's improved a little bit going up to fast and further going up to faster. The reference screen shown in the final column, that is the MSI MAG345CQR, which is a sort of average performing VA model really, as you can see with the more extended smeary trailing behind the UFOs, particularly for the top row, which is the dark background. The fastest setting on this AOC, that imparts quite a lot of overshoot, might not be obvious in these images, although you can certainly see quite a bit of an inky look in places, but to the eye there's a lot of bright overshoot inverse ghosting and some inky looking trailing, and it's really distracting, so I don't like using that setting at all in practice. So from this I would pick faster. Looking now at some figures, these are taken using the OSRTT Pro tool, the same tool and methodology used by TFT Central, although they use their own color coding system. And being read here are initial response times. The average initial time with the normal setting, and that's what I'm showing you here, is 6.38 milliseconds, so that's fairly slow, although I wouldn't say super slow for a VA model. This is achieved with essentially zero overshoot. Bumping up to the fast setting, that does improve things a bit, so you go from 6.38 milliseconds to 4.96 milliseconds for your average initial time. There's still some red on the graph here, and quite a bit of golden green to orange shades. There's also a little bit of overshoot introduced, but nothing extreme. Switching over to my preferred faster setting, that improves things further. Average initial time is now down from 4.96 milliseconds to 4.14 milliseconds. So not a huge difference, but it does speed things up a little bit, and there's a bit more green on the graph here. There's also somewhat more widespread overshoot, distributed slightly differently, so there's actually slightly less for some transitions. This is not extreme overshoot, and it's not super widespread by any means. Moving up to the fastest setting, that does improve things because you go from an average initial time of 4.14 to 2.87 milliseconds. That's a significant improvement. However, it comes at the expense of significant overshoot, which, as I mentioned before, is very visible and distracting to the eye. I think even people who are not particularly sensitive to overshoot are going to find this setting problematic. I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm going to talk about how the experience is in-game with all of this in mind. So I've got the game running at a good solid 180 frames a second. I'm making the most out of the 180 Hz that the monitor can provide. And in terms of how things feel, that 180 Hz, 180 frames a second experience is certainly nice, a good level of fluidity. That's also aided by low input lag. In this case, I measured 1.98 milliseconds. So that is a very good low level of input lag, indicating a very low signal delay, and that's the main element of input lag you feel. This is similar whether you've got adaptive sync disabled with low input lag active, or you have adaptive sync enabled, which greys out that setting. If you're not using adaptive sync and you disable low input lag, the experience is horrific. It feels like you're on some kind of insane satellite delay, and I'm not talking about Starlink here, I'm talking about some sort of old school satellite, which is massively high latency. So the imperfections and pixel responses, which I've already explored objectively, they do have an effect, although in scenes like this it's not really too dramatic because the main weaknesses are confined to the high contrast transitions. Where you might see them in this scene is between the sort of dark areas, the edges of the wall there, and the sky in the background. But even this doesn't produce a sort of extended smoky appearance or an obvious smeary trailing really. More of a sort of what I describe as a heavy powdery trailing. So it does add general mask of perceived blur, and I don't have any complaints using my preferred faster setting in the way of overshoot here either, nothing that draws the eye. For those interested, this is what the fastest setting looks like. You can see some really colourful overshoot around the flag post there. My camera's sometimes really good at filtering this out, so you might not be able to see it in the video, but to the eye, around the bush as well, really colourful bright halo trailing all over the place. I find that pretty distracting, and actually in this scene it's not too bad. There's certainly some much worse examples. So again, I don't think this is an attractive setting. There's also a lot of inky trailing now, by the way, around the brickwork, so it has this sort of inky black outline when it moves, which looks really odd. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one has a lot of those transitions which the monitor struggles with more, and I'm using my preferred faster setting again, by the way. So around the flag post, the bushes there, lots of dark shades with medium to lighter backgrounds. You know, there's a slightly smeary look to the trailing here, but it's not too pronounced, certainly as far as VA models go. And there's just a general extra mask of perceived blur, which is stronger than what I observed on the previous scene. That's just because of the shade combinations here. The monitor does perform them more slowly. But again, there's nothing bothersome in the way of overshoot. And you can see a bit of an inky look to the trailing here. This isn't overshoot, but it's some of the smeary trailing, or a bit smeary. It looks like the objects are sort of bleeding into the background a bit. Another thing you can observe with these slower than optimal pixel responses is a bit of a flickering effect. If you move the mouse, some shades darken, and then you stop moving the mouse, they return to their proper value. You can see it on the bush here, for example. So slight movements can get this kind of flickering effect going, which some people find a bit distracting. It's not super strong on this model, but it is still a factor. I'm on X, or what used to be Twitter, just to show you some desktop examples. So I've been using this monitor quite a bit for productivity just on the desktop. I have observed some weaknesses. So if you're scrolling, or certain animations in some applications do give this kind of blended look to the text, or more blended than you'd ideally like. But I'd say again, it's not too bad for a VA model. You also get that flickering effect like I showed you with the bush, but you can get that with text as well. So you don't really get that when you're scrolling, at least you don't if you're scrolling on Chrome because of how the scrolling behaviour is. If you're using other browsers or certain websites or other applications with a smoother look to the scrolling, where it doesn't sort of jump as many lines at a time, that kind of thing, then you may observe this flickering effect, but it can certainly show you what it would look like with slight movements of the window there. You can see the grey text flickering against the black background. On some VA models it would pretty much disappear completely during movement, so it would be an even more pronounced flickering effect than I'm showing you here. And if you're using, shall we say, a more conventional looking white background with dark text, it's actually the same grey shade, it's just that the background shade has changed, so it's black text, grey text. You don't get that kind of flickering effect. So these transitions are performed more rapidly. There's actually a little bit of overshoot, but it's very light overshoot, it's not distracting. At least I certainly don't think it is. So it performs better here. The monitor also supports VRR via adaptive sync, so you can use AMD FreeSync and you can use Nvidia G-Sync compatible. So this means you can use it on a PC with an appropriate GPU, or you could use it on the Xbox Series X, for example, but you can't use it on the PS5. There's no HDMI 2.1 VRR. The VRR range of the monitor is between 48 and 180 Hz. And if it goes below 48 Hz, there's LFC, low frame rate compensation, which will keep tearing and stuttering at bay by ensuring where possible that the monitor is sticking to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So thinking about the kind of experience you'd get at 120 Hz, whether it's static or under VRR, the requirements for a good performance here are reduced compared to 180 Hz, but you can still see some weaknesses. They're a bit different though, so the faster setting here, you can actually see a little bit more overshoot, or it's edging a bit more towards overshoot. So if you're particularly sensitive to that, you may want to consider using the fast setting now, but I still prefer to use faster, even at 120 Hz, and just more broadly, really anything in the triple digits for my refresh rate. And again, you can see a much better performance here than the reference screen. The fastest setting, that again gives a lot of overshoot. It's actually even stronger now, and to the eye is very distracting and eye-catching. Now to look at some figures at 120 Hz, using the normal setting. Average initial time 7.24 milliseconds, not particularly good even for 120 Hz. No overshoot to speak of. Bumping up to the fast setting, that reduces the average initial time from 7.24 to 4.76 milliseconds. That's a very significant improvement. There is a bit of overshoot, but it's really quite isolated. The faster setting, well, relative to fast, it's kind of similar to what I observed at 180 Hz in that it speeds things up a bit. So your average initial time goes from 4.76 to 3.64 milliseconds, which is actually pretty competent for 120 Hz, but it does come at the expense of more widespread overshoot, although the strongest overshoot is still orange on the graph rather than red. So it's slightly different overshoot behavior, but I don't consider this to be extreme overshoot, so I would still use faster even at 120 Hz, like I said before. And for those of you who enjoy a joke, here's the fastest setting. The average initial time has gone from 3.64 milliseconds to 2.68 milliseconds, but to achieve that, it comes with loads of overshoot. Lots of red on the graph here for the overshoot. Really not nice at all. So with all this in mind, there is a reduction in the look to the smeary trailing, as in the pixel responses are performing pretty well because of the lower requirements here, or at least better than they were before. Not that it was terrible before for a VA panel, but just thinking more broadly. And a little bit of overshoot in places, but nothing I find too eye-catching, and I've observed this more broadly, not just on this scene, so I'd again still stick to the faster setting because it does speed things up a bit compared to fast, as I showed you before. You do naturally get worse connected feel and an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement, and that's just because you've got a lower frame rate now, 120 rather than 180 FPS. But VRR does its thing at least to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches, so even if you're not considering, 120 frames a second on the dot and you were having a bit of fluctuation between that and 180, that's really where VRR helps out a lot. Now we're in the game at 60 frames a second, the monitor is running at 60 Hz to match that, and let's just dive straight into some objective data first. So pursuit photographs, different look to things here because the faster setting now has more noticeable overshoot. It's not extreme, but it is certainly more extreme than it was at high refresh rates. So if you're sensitive to that, you may want to stick to fast, possibly normal, but we'll analyze that with some figures very shortly, and that will help you. And the fastest setting, super inky overshoot, but when we compare to the reference screen, even the normal setting of the AOC is significantly faster. So using the normal setting, lots of red on the graph here, slow pixel responses, although not as bad as it would be at a high refresh rate because the requirements for a good performance are reduced now, but still this isn't what I consider a good performance at all. Average initial time, 9.42 milliseconds, very little overshoot, so you can certainly improve things. And you do improve things by using the fast setting. Average initial time goes from 9.42 milliseconds to 5.11 milliseconds. Less red on the graph here, a good speed up now. There is a bit of overshoot, but it's not super widespread or extreme by any means. Bumping up to faster, that drops your average initial time from 5.11 to 4.01 milliseconds. So it does speed things up a bit, although not massively. And it does come at the expense of quite a bit of overshoot. You can see it's pretty widespread, lots of orange on the overshoot graph now. So I'm still using that faster setting, and some people may find that fine, but there is a little bit more overshoot than I'd like. I'd probably want to stick to fast. I'm not going to change it. I don't think the camera is really going to capture these differences very well. You might see some overshoot now, but when I switch over to the other setting, you probably won't really see much difference. So it's just a sort of visual preference I have. I find the overshoot levels too high now, but you might find them fine, in which case you could just stick to faster for the entire refresh rate range, and that's fine if you find it fine. But I think really I'll just let the figures and the pursuit photographs do the talking here, because they better show the differences between the two settings than I can show you in the video. But yeah, the weaknesses are certainly less apparent now. Not really much in the way of smeary trailing. The sort of flickering effect I was talking about before, subdued significantly. Much less apparent now. But the connected feel is really terrible compared to the high refresh rates. Again, that's just because of the frame rate, and yes, there's more perceived blur due to eye movement, so the overall experience is just not as nice as it is at the high refresh rates. I'm now going to talk about VRR flickering. So this test, it's linked in the video description. It causes significant fluctuations in the refresh rate, so the frame rate's going all over the place, and because I'm using VRR, the refresh rate is as well. And that does cause some flickering behavior on VA models like this typically, and I can observe some here. This isn't extreme or super strong flickering, and actually if anything it's probably exaggerated a bit in the video. Unlike on OLEDs, it doesn't just affect the dark to medium shades, actually the entire screen can flicker in places, sort of full screen flash behavior. But it's really not too strong in my opinion, because these are extreme fluctuations that are occurring right now. If your frame rate's more stable, then the flickering is more minor and less noticeable, but for both large and small fluctuations it is less noticeable than it is on some VA models. And actually it's not too easy for me to show you good examples of this in-game, so I'm not even going to go through in-game scenes, but just note that you might notice it in places in loading screens and in-game maps, and also just in-game in general, more so if you're having significant changes in your frame rate and you're using VRR, so that translates to a big change in the refresh rate suddenly. Something else that would trigger that behavior is if you cross the LFC boundary, and this test does go above and below the LFC boundary quite a lot, and that's really the main thing which causes the more significant and noticeable flickering on this test. But again, it's not extreme, it's there. And it's something which some people might notice and find bothersome, so I do like to mention it for completeness. I'd also just like to quickly mention here, this isn't related to VRR flickering, but just because I was talking about 60 Hz before, you get the same kind of experience that I described at 60 Hz gaming if you're watching 60 frames a second movie content. For lower frame rate movie content, which is common on platforms like Netflix, that'll run at about 23 to 30 frames a second. The pixel response requirements for decent performance are much looser at that point. You might still notice some slight weaknesses in places, but they really are slight at that point. I watched that kind of content a lot on the monitor, and I didn't really feel that the responsiveness hampered the experience significantly. This monitor also has a setting called MBR, Motion Blur Reduction, and that's a strobe backlight setting which can be activated if you have 120 Hz or above selected on the monitor. It causes the backlight to flicker at a frequency matching that of the monitor. Sensitivity to the flickering varies, and it becomes easier to notice at reduced refresh rates. The main MBR setting is only available if adaptive sync is disabled in the OSD. So you can see that here, you can set that between 0 and 20, with 20 having a stronger effect, but also reducing the brightness. So what it's doing is it's adjusting the pulse width of the monitor to maximize motion clarity at high values, with the monitor spending a relatively high proportion of its time in the off phase of the pulse for those interested. With this set to 1, by the way, what you see on the video is not a good demonstration of what you'd see by eye. I'm just showing you the setting as it would appear in the OSD. You're locked to a brightness of 370 nits because you can't adjust the brightness when you're using the MBR setting, because your MBR setting is your brightness control. So that was 370 nits. If you go all the way up to an MBR of 20, you get around 90 nits. So that's your brightness adjustment range now, between 90 and 370 nits. I'd say an NBR of 15 or above is really what you want for a good level of motion clarity, but it's quite subjective. You might find anything above 10 okay. You can adjust the overdrive setting when you're using NBR. You might also notice there's an extreme setting here. That's just a shortcut which will set the overdrive to fastest and NBR to 20. I also noticed that when I enable NBR, it seems to revert the overdrive to normal, which is a little inconvenient as it's another thing to change, but I tend to prefer faster in general for the same reasons as with NBR disabled. If you've got adaptive sync enabled to using VRR, then there's a setting called NBR sync instead of NBR. In theory at least, it allows you to use VRR at the same time as NBR. It appears to work, a term I use loosely, across the entire VRR range. In practice though, the setting is terrible. It's similar to using a very low and therefore ineffective NBR level, perhaps equivalent to an NBR setting of 5, if that, but you have no control over that NBR level and you can't raise it. You end up with the brightness being locked around 325 nits, which is rather bright, and you get strong strobe crosstalk, which overlaps the main image, more on this shortly, which creates an unfocused mess. You could argue there is a degree of blur reduction, but only in a similar way to using an old LCD with low frequency PWM flickering, and that would cause any trailing to fragment. Some people may see some utility in this setting, but if you want at least a decent level of motion blur reduction, you should really try using NBR alone without the sync element. So these pursuit photographs will give you a nice idea of what this setting is doing. It's not something which I can show you with actual video footage that just doesn't capture this kind of behaviour on the monitor properly at all. So you can see there's NBR off and then NBR set to 1 and NBR set to 20, as well as NBR sync. The clarity of the main object, the UFO, significantly improves when you're going up to NBR 20, and again, as I said, perhaps NBR 15 and above. So that reflects a significant reduction in the perceived blur. You might notice there's a red or magenta fringe in places, and that's related to the slow red phosphor decay of the KSF phosphors used for the backlight. It's very common on wide gamut LCD monitors unless they use a quantum dot LED backlight instead. In practice, when gaming with the setting, you can also see the fringing behind or in front of some objects, and it's very obvious in some instances. So the clearest example with the UFOs here would be for the dark background, the top photo with NBR 20. There are also additional colourful flashes or colours such as red, magenta and cyan that can be seen in places. I'm personally quite sensitive to this and I don't enjoy that aspect or indeed the colourful fringing. But again, sensitivity to this does vary. So when I was talking about strobe crosstalk earlier, that's really the repetitions of the object you can see behind or in front. And actually when you're using an NBR setting of 1 and NBR sync, you can see the strobe crosstalk basically meld with the main object, which creates this really nasty effect. I find it visually uncomfortable, and it just means that it isn't giving you the kind of blur reduction you would expect from this kind of setting, which is what NBR 20 gives you instead. With NBR 20, there is some distinct fragmentation or strobe crosstalk behind generally for the central region of the screen, which is shown here, but it's fainter than the main object, which is good to see. That was at 180 Hz. For those interested, this is 120 Hz. I'm not going to do too much analysis here, just let you look at the photos if you're interested, just to show you that again, NBR sync and NBR 1 don't perform very well, but NBR 20 is a good setting if you want to reduce blur, which is really the main purpose of using this kind of setting. Now coming back to the idea of strobe crosstalk, this is at 180 Hz, but it would apply at other refresh rates as well in much the same way. With NBR, by the way, not NBR sync. I've had enough of talking about and showing you NBR sync. So there's NBR 20, my preferred faster overdrive setting, but this shows the UFO at various points of the screen. Because not all regions of the screen refresh simultaneously, you get varying levels of strobe crosstalk vertically. The central region of the screen, that's where your eyes will mainly focus if you're playing FPS games, and there the strobe crosstalk levels aren't too bad, much as I was showing you before. For other games such as strategy games, games with scrolling text further up the screen, and combat flight simulators, that kind of thing, you may be more frequently observing the top or bottom of the screen. Further down the screen, the strobe crosstalk behind the object is stronger, and further up the screen, things are quite bad, because you can see that there is a strong repetition of the object in front, as well as additional faint strobe crosstalk behind. In practice, I found it pretty bothersome at times when I was looking near the top of the screen when I was gaming, with the setting active, but elsewhere on the screen, it was okay. Just to reinforce again that the observations are broadly similar regardless of the refresh rate, but the trailing is slightly less bold at lower refresh rates. Now, because I've said that NBR sync is rubbish, you do really want your frame rate to be really laser locked to your refresh rate, so you want a very solid 120 frames a second or above to really be considering using NBR, and then you will set your monitor to a fixed refresh rate which matches that frame rate exactly. Otherwise you're going to get really incredibly annoying stuttering, which becomes very easy to notice because there's very little perceived blur to mask it. So with all of this in mind, I do think that NBR set to 15 or above, so not NBR Sync, is a setting which some will enjoy and find very useful, even if it's not technically the cleanest or best performing strobe backlight setting out there. To wrap up then, very basic design to this monitor. A tilt-only stand, so you couldn't adjust the height even. It's at a reasonable distance from the desk and it's quite a large screen, so I found it was okay without adjustment for me, but that does depend on your height and your desk and that kind of thing. It does have VESA holes if you want to use alternative mounting. In terms of its performance, the usual VA strengths when it came to contrast, a bit of VA glow, a bit of clouding at the top and bottom of the screen as well, but the overall contrast experience was on the stronger side for an LCD. The colour performance was also quite good for the panel type. Yes, there were some colour consistency and viewing angle issues, but you'd expect that for a VA panel. They weren't extreme in this case. I wouldn't say the curve of the screen itself did much to change that, but that was really more to give an extra feeling of depth and immersion when you're using the monitor. Though I actually found when I was using the monitor for productivity, I didn't really notice the curve much, at least when I'd been using it for a couple of weeks. So it wasn't something which annoyed me in any way. And I also think the resolution and the overall pixel density is one which many people will get on with quite well. It's quite a nice combination if you want an immersive screen and you're not interested in 4K because of your budget, because of your system performance reasons, or simply because of your own preferences. When it came to responsiveness, this is the Achilles heel of VA models, and that was also the case here, although I've used it for a few weeks now, and I'd say that typically when I'm gaming competitively on VA models, I feel that I'm very much held back and frustrated due to major weaknesses in pixel response times. There's usually obvious and widespread smeary trailing, which can only ever be replaced by potentially even more distracting bright overshoot. In this case, I didn't really get that sense. I played a lot of competitive or semi-competitive Delta Force and some Battlefield, and I found I was able to perform pretty well. Yeah, there were some pixel response weaknesses, and my competitive gaming performance wasn't at the level it would be with the OLED I mainly use for gaming, but I wouldn't expect it to be, and my OLED monitor does cost around 5 times as much as this AOC. I don't know, maybe I was just on form when I was gaming with this monitor during the review period. Either way though, I was pleasantly surprised by that aspect of the monitor. I stress again, it's always subjective when it comes to responsiveness, but I did feel for a VA model this one was pretty decent. VRR did its thing as well without any major issues, a bit of VRR flickering but nothing massive in that respect. Also nice to see very low input lag on the monitor, so that wasn't a problem either. So with all that said, this monitor comes in at around £200 or $200 US, that sort of seems to go in and out of stock on Amazon in the US. It doesn't seem to be fully stocked yet, so that price could change a bit, but with this price in mind, I think really you do get a lot of monitor for your money. I think it's a nice monitor to use for a range of different applications, whether it's gaming, watching some video content, or just on the desktop. And I think AOC has put the panel it uses to good use. So that's really all there is to the AOC CQ32G4VE. You'll find additional content in the description of the video, as well as information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.